Welcome to the video for Chapter 11 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to formally introduce you to external sandhi and is going to focus on consonant sandhi. Let's begin by recapping what we already know about sandhi. Sandhi or sandhi is a term that literally means putting together, and it's a Sanskrit technical term for changes in pronunciation that occur when sounds come in contact with other sounds, whether within words, which is what we then call internal sandhi, or at word boundaries, i.e. the last sound of one word and the first sound of the following word, which is what we would consider external sandhi. Sandhi happens across languages. For example, in English, if you compare do you versus don't you, you can tell that there's a little bit of a difference in the pronunciation of the you the second time. First time I say you, second time I say something closer to shu, do you versus don't you. This happens because this y is preceded by a voiceless sound t in the second example, and so it also becomes a little less voiced, it becomes more voiceless. Do you versus don't you. The difference in sandhi between English and Sanskrit is that Sanskrit regularly reflects these pronunciation changes in writing. It's basically as though English would write do you versus don't you, D-O-N-T-C-H-O-U. Now, given that Sanskrit does reflect these pronunciation changes in writing, we A, can tell pretty accurately how Sanskrit would have been pronounced, but B, it also means that we need to know about all these pronunciation changes so that when we see them reflected in writing, we can still identify the individual words that have been changed through sandhi. So in other words, we see don't you, D-O-N-T-C-H-O-U, and still need to be able to determine, to find out, to remember that underlyingly this is don't you. External sandhi can be summed up as the following. Sanskrit words regularly change their pronunciation when they stand together with other words. Sanskrit spelling marks all these changes. This process is called external sandhi, and its general principles are quite simple. 1. The last sound of a word changes depending on the first sound of the next word. Sometimes that first sound also changes. 2. A consonant at the end of a word becomes more similar to the first sound of the next word. And 3. A vowel at the end of a word interacts and usually merges with a following vowel. A vowel at the end of a word remains the same when a consonant follows. Let's focus on the consonant part of this. A consonant at the end of a word becomes more similar to the first sound of the next word. Now, becoming more similar means adopting one or several of the features of that sound at the beginning of the next word, and such features include voice, aspiration, nasalization, and so on. So, for example, a voiceless sound becomes voiced before another voiced sound. So T changes into D, K becomes G, or more strictly put, K becomes G, and so on. For example, in Nagarat, Gramam Gacchati, he is going from the city, Nagarat, to the village, Gramam. We have a change in Nagarat to Nagarad. The T changes into its voiced equivalent D because it's followed by a voiced sound at the beginning of Gramam. And so instead of Nagarat, we have Nagarad, Gramam Gacchati. Before a word initial nasal, preceding final stops turn into the equivalent nasal. So, for example, Gramam, Nagarat, Gacchati. He is not going, Nagacchati, Nagarat, from the city, Gramam, to the village. Nagarat, he stands in front of na. Na begins with a nasal, and therefore the T at the end of Nagarat also turns into a nasal. T is a dental stop, and therefore it turns into the dental nasal, N, and we are left with Gramam, Nagaran, na Gacchati. Aspiration of initial consonants, however, does not affect the preceding sound. So if I have a word that begins with k, g, ch, j, and so on, this aspiration is not passed on to the sound at the end of the preceding word. However, initial H voices preceding stops, and this H itself turns into the corresponding voiced aspirated stop. For example, Nagarat hi gacchati. He is indeed, he means indeed, going away from the city, Nagarat. We have Nagarat followed by an H at the beginning of he. The T at the end of Nagarat becomes voiced, so Nagarat is changed into Nagarad, and he is changed into the corresponding voiced aspirated stop, corresponding to the sound at the end of the preceding word. That sound is a dental, and so the H turns into the dental voiced aspirated stop, dhi. If we had a word that ended in a velar, the H would have voiced that velar, so for example from k to g, and itself would have changed into the velar voiced aspirated stop, ghi, and so on. Sandhi is actually made much easier by the fact that there's only a small number of so-called permitted final sounds. In word final position, i.e. at the end of a word in Sanskrit, you will find only a handful of consonants. You will not find any voiced stops, and you will not find any aspirated stops, and palatals are entirely absent. And so this limits the number of possible external sandhi combinations that involve stops, and therefore we can put all the different possibilities for external sandhi into one table, which is this table here, and yes, it looks a little scary. So let's look at this bit by bit. In the top line, where it says final sound, we have those just mentioned permitted final sounds. So there is a K, so K, there's T, there's T, there's P, there's N, N, and M. On the right-hand side, we have the initial sounds of the following word, so the sounds that the following word, the next word, begins with. In the first line, we have 0, meaning there is no word following. The word that we're looking at is the final word in a sentence, and if that's the case, then actually all these sounds remain exactly as they are. So final K remains as K, final T remains as T, final T remains as T, and so on. Initial sounds of following words might be any sound, so they could be vowels, they could be any of our velars, so k or k, g or g, palatals, ch or ch, j or j, retroflex sounds, dental sounds, labial sounds, nasals, words can start with n or with m. They could be semivowels, so y or w, or r or l. They can be any of our s sounds, so sh, sh or s, or they could be an h. These are the possibilities for what a word may begin with. As I'm sure you've noticed, the lines of this table come in two colors. Now, the ones that are colored in are basically for all those lines where the initial sound of the following word is voiced. So this could be vowels, this could be g or g, j or j, d or d, d or d, b or b, n, m, y, w, r, l, and h. In Sanskrit, h or h is voiced. And whenever you have one of these sounds, then what happens is that the preceding sound, the final sound at the end of the preceding word, is voiced. Furthermore, what happens is that if the next word, the following word, begins with a nasal, then the final sound of the preceding word is nasalized. So if you look at the line for N or M, which is about a little bit more than halfway down this table, you will see that K has changed into Ng. Ng is the velar nasal corresponding to the velar stop K. T has changed into N, so the retroflex stop has changed into the retroflex nasal. T has changed into N. The dental has changed into the dental nasal. P, the labial stop, has changed into the labial nasal M. Ng is a nasal, remains as a Ng. Final N is a nasal, remains as N. And final M finally, changes into anuswara because, and that's a change that we've already looked at, if you have a final M, it remains as an M in front of a vowel, or it changes into an anuswara in front of anything else. Now, how can we make sense, how can we approach, how can we memorize this admittedly huge table? There actually are quite a number of ways to familiarize yourself with the Sandhi rules. First of all, you might find it helpful to photocopy or print out the Sandhi tables from this book or from the book website, cambridge-sanskrit.org. You can find handouts to print out in the other resources section. Once you've done that, use this printout or use this photocopy as a bookmark and refer to it very regularly. Basically, whenever you can't recognize a Sandhi that you're looking at, just look at the table, find out what it is, and the more often you do that, the more familiar you will become with all these little details. However, what's perhaps even more important than knowing all the little details is understanding the basic principles behind consonant Sandhi. So to remember that a final consonant changes and becomes more similar to the consonant at the beginning of the next word, or the sound at the beginning of the next word, and if the sound at the beginning of the next word is voiced, it itself becomes voiced. If it's a nasal, it itself becomes nasalized, and so on. If you do want to memorize anything, then it should be the columns for final T, final N, and final M, because those are by far the most frequently occurring consonants at the end of Sanskrit words. And out of these three columns, M actually is really easy, because if M at the end of a word is followed by nothing or followed by a vowel, it remains as M. If it's followed by anything else, the M changes into an anuswara, un. If you know that, you've already memorized your first column in the consonant Sandhi table. There's one more thing that we need to look at concerning Sandhi, and that is Sanskrit writing conventions. Now, as was already mentioned, Sanskrit does reflect pronunciation changes that come about through Sandhi in its writing. So, for example, if a final sound becomes voiced, so for example a T changes into a D, then that is reflected in the writing. But there's one other thing that we need to know about, and that concerns words that end in a consonant. Normally, if a word ends in a consonant and no vowel follows, then this is rendered by writing that word with a virama at the end. A virama is that little diagonal dash at the bottom of a consonant that indicates this consonant is not followed by any other vowel. Now, a virama is actually only used at the end of a word where no other word follows. If a word ends in a consonant, and therefore a virama, and another word follows, then actually what happens is that use of virama is avoided by combining the two words in writing. So, for example, we have the sentence from earlier, Nagarat hi gacchati, which changes through Sandhi into Nagarad dhi gacchati. So in front of an H, the T becomes voiced, and the H changes into the corresponding voiced aspirated stop, so into dh, and so we have Nagarad dhi gacchati. As I said, Sanskrit avoids using a virama within a sentence, and so the d and the dh are combined in writing, and that's how we arrive at Nagarad dhi gacchati. He is indeed going away from the city. If we have, to look at another example, Nagarat na gacchati, he is not going away from the city, then the T in front of the N, Nagarat in front of na, changes into an N, so we have Nagaran na. In front of a nasal, a stop also changes into a nasal, and it changes into the corresponding nasal, so the dental stop T changes into the dental nasal N, Nagaran na gacchati. And again, we don't want to use virama inside a sentence, and so from Nagaran na gacchati, we get the spelling Nagaran na gacchati. Finally, Nagarat iha gacchati. He is going here, Nagarat, from the city. Nagarat is followed by a word beginning with a vowel. A vowel is always voiced, And so nagarat, in front of a voiced sound, changes into nagarad. And this nagarad is then joined in writing with iha. And that means rather than having the I at the beginning of iha, that is used at the beginning of a word, so rather than having this full sign for I, we now use the sign for I that we get whenever an I, a short I, follows upon a consonant. And so we have nagaradiha gacchati. This makes reading Sanskrit considerably more difficult, because rather than having individual words, you now have things that could be one very long word, or indeed they could be more than one word. What it takes to cope with that is basically patience and experience and the knowledge that generations of Sanskrit students before you have found it challenging, but have in the end mastered it. The whole thing becomes even more tricky when we look at words beginning with an initial a, with a short a, because if you remember, a short a after a consonant is not written, is not indicated at all. So, for example, nagarat apagacchati, he goes away from the city, gives us nagarad apagacchati, and then finally the two words are joined in writing so that we can avoid the use of the virama at the end of nagarad, and so you have nagarad apagacchati. If you're faced in a text with nagarad apagacchati, you will probably be able to recognize nagarad as nagarat, but then it will be very, very easy to just read the next word as pagacchati. And if you can't recognize that, then I can't blame you, because pagacchati is not a word. What you need to remember is that actually there is an a, an unwritten a in there, and so you need to then split this up as nagarad apagacchati. A joyful note here, there is no joining up of words after an anuswara or visarga. So, for example, if I have narang pashyami, I see a man, then after this anuswara, the words are not joined up. Similarly with narach pashyati, at the end or after this visarga, narach, there is no joining of words. The words remain written separately and therefore are much easier to recognize. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!